Hello, I'm Sally Pointer. Today I'm mostly looking at the horse chestnut. As soon as the autumn term starts, that was always the time to start looking for conkers, and you could usually find something fallen out of the tree and oh look, treasure. Isn't that just a beautiful thing? Who could resist that gorgeous glossy outer? But of course, not just for games of conkers. There are lots of things you can do with these amazing nuts. The horse chestnut's native to southeast Europe, but it's now widespread through Europe, North America and Canada. It was introduced to Britain by John Tradescant the Elder in the early 17th century, and we just forget that we haven't always had it as part of our landscape. Conkers, of course, are not edible. They contain far too many alkaloids, saponins and glucosides, but whilst this makes them unsafe to eat, they do have other useful properties, beside being a key part in the game of conkers. Generally, once you find one fallen chestnut, there'll be loads more, and I'm not just after the conkers inside. I've got uses for the prickly cases too. So, big bag full, we'll get these home, sort them out, and I'll tell you what I'm going to be doing with them. Having got my treasure home, next thing I need to do is sort it out. Now, some of the conkers are going to come to pieces really easily. I'm just going to put the husks in the sink. I want those something in a second. Others, like this one, were a bit underripe and needed some persuasion. But actually, these ones where the shell hasn't completely formed yet do have a use of their own. So just work through them. Sometimes a bit of persuasion helps. We used to stamp on them in the playground at school. Just sort out your treasure until you end up with a pile of husks and a pile of shells. And of course, don't confuse these with the sweet chestnut, which is the edible one. This is a completely different family. You can't eat these. Right, now then, we'll come on to what I'm doing with the husks in a second, but one of the uses that's really famous for conkers is as a natural soap substitute. And the tree is in the soapberry family, so it does give you a clue straight away. There's loads of information on the internet about how to do this, so I'll just give you a quick version. You want something nice and heavy. I like a big pestle and mortar. Chuck in some conkers. And I'm using about 4, which most people find is about right for a load of laundry. Give them a swash. It's alive. Now, if you're doing white laundry, take out the husk. It can add brown tones. In my case, it doesn't matter in the slightest, but I am going to separate them out a little bit because also, in a moment, want to talk about a Victorian use for these, which does call for the husk being removed. So you can leave them on or not, as the case may be, but if they come off easily, it's probably just as well to remove them so that the soap is a nice pale colour. Some people put them in the food processor. The husk at this stage is quite soft. It's one of the reasons why, if you were playing conkers at school, you went to such lengths to find a way to toughen up your champion conker. Break it down into bits. In my case, rescuing the bits that are escaping. And then we'll add some water. Now, because I just want to show you what's going on, I'll just use some lukewarm water from the kettle. And straight away, when you see those suds on top, what's happening is the water is dissolving out the saponins, and saponins are the natural soapy elements. And this makes it a really good cleanser. Now, if I let this soak for an hour or so, I'll have a really milky liquid, which is excellent for doing the laundry. If you just want to do ordinary household laundry, crush up 4 or 5 conkers, tie them in a mesh bag or the toe of an old pair of tights, throw them in with the laundry, or you can extract the liquid, strain that off so you haven't got any bits to worry about, put that in as well. That works really quite well. as with anything that contains saponins, the amount you're likely to use domestically for washing your hands or for washing a load of laundry isn't going to do any immediate harm. You wouldn't want to pour quantities of this directly out into the environment because saponins do kill off insects and fish and all the rest of it. So dispose of things responsibly. Washing your hands while camping with a few conkers, that's not going to do any harm at all. So I'm going to finish prepping my conkers. Shells are going in the sink for the second. Conkers for laundry are either being put by, or I want to actually make a batch up to start steeping. We'll return to that in a second. I'll get this prepped and we'll restart the camera. This early 19th century text is a perfect example of how horse chestnut saponins were being used almost on a semi-industrial scale. You could do this at home, but they're really talking about something a bit more widespread than that. I'll read it out, I know it's hard to see on the screen. Efficacy of horse chestnuts in bleaching linen and clearing woolen stuffs, and as a ley for preparing hemp. The manner of making this ley is to peel the chestnuts and rasp them as fine as possible into soft water. This is done 10 or 12 hours before the mixture is to be used, and in the meanwhile it is stirred from time to time, the better dissolve these raspings and impregnate the water. The last stirring is given about a quarter of an hour before the water is drawn off from the thickest part of the raspings which subside, and this is done either by inclining the vessel and pouring off the ley gently, or by ladling it out by hand while the water is yet white and froths like soap suds. In order to use this ley, it is made rather hotter than the hand can well bear, and the hemp is then steeped and washed in it as in soap suds. Linen may also be washed in this ley, and even when very dirty, much less soap will be required than is commonly used, it being sufficient to rub the dirtiest parts only with soap. The raspings of the chestnut, which sink to the bottom of the ley, are good for fowls and pigs. Hemp as above prepared may be dyed like silk, wool or cotton, and may be made into stuff and garments of all kinds. A great advantage attending the use of this material is that it will not be destroyed by those insects which devour woolen cloth. High claims indeed. I'm going to take inspiration from that Victorian recipe and use horse chestnuts today as the soap source for the scouring of some wool for a dye batch. Now, I mentioned conkers earlier that hadn't had the shells form properly yet, like this one, where they're mostly white on the outside, just a bit of brown. Those ones, because they haven't got all the dark outer, are particularly good for doing laundry because there's less of the brown bits to pick off. So, if you do get any that are technically a bit underripe, put those by for whitewashing. That's quite useful. So I crushed some earlier, but chopping with a knife into quarters, watching your fingers of course, does mean that you can also peel off the shells quite easily. Or again, if you're not too worried about the little bit of extra coloration from the shells, just chuck that into your laundry. So I'm going to put these into a jelly bag, rubber band the top. I've prepared my skeins of yarn in the usual way, so they've been tied up in loops. My conkers are in my bag. There's some water in the bottom. I'm just going to squeeze it all together. Then I'm going to top the water up. This is going to go on the stove. I'm going to bring it very slowly to the boil, during which time the saponins will release from my conkers. Should get a few bubbles. I'm not going to agitate it much. I don't want to felt the yarn. I'm going to let it simmer for 20 minutes or so, then I'm going to switch it off, let it cool down. That should remove any grease, dirt, spinning oils from the yarn and have it ready to be mordanted, which is my next step. While the yarn is scouring, I'm going to prepare my dye bath, and that's why I've been saving the conker husks, the green outer shell, and you can see how it's starting to oxidise already. These will produce some quite interesting dye colours. Now, it's definitely one where you want to use plenty. I'm going to use at least double the amount of yarn that I'm planning on dyeing. So what I'm going to do, I've rinsed this very briefly just to take any mud off, nothing too serious. I'm just going to chop these into more manageable pieces. Do watch your fingers. So I'm just going to chop these slightly. Then I'm going to weigh out two particular batches. There's a reason for that. I will get to that in a moment. And we'll get those prepared. So I think I'm going to make sure I've got at least 200 grams in each dye bath, so I can do at least 100 grams of yarn. If I can manage a bit more, that's great. I've also thrown in here my peelings from setting up the conkers for the scouring. I don't think that's going to hurt. It certainly might have a bit of extra colour in it. We know that that can make laundry a little dingy if you put it in with the whites. So chopped up like that will be fine. I'm going to set up 2 batches and then we'll look at getting those soaked and ready to go. A few seconds chopping later and I actually had enough husks to do about 450 grams in each pan, which is great. With natural dyes, quite often the more concentrated the dye bath, the better the end result, and this is no exception. Now this dye bath is aluminium. I'm just going to top it up with water. I'm going to leave it overnight to soak. It just happens to be an aluminium pan. It's not actually important for this process. This pan though is a nice lined steel one, so I'm going to top this one up with water, but I'm also going to make it very alkali. Now you could use ammonia for this, you could use washing soda. I happen to have some wood ash lye that's been maturing for a while. I use this in soap making. In fact, I'm going to be doing some soap making from scratch videos later in the year. Just to show you how dramatically alkaline it is, these are universal indicator papers. And if I carefully, because I haven't got any gloves on, dunk this in there, see how bright that colour changes. If I compare that to the indicator page, that's pH 11. It's really, really strongly alkali. So I'm going to put in probably about 2 or 3 tablespoons of this, so a glug. I'm going to put it by carefully so I don't hurt my hands. Top this up with water, let it soak overnight. That's going to give me time to finish scouring my yarn and getting it mordanted before we go on to the fun part. An hour or so has gone by and my scouring water has been up to the boil, had its 20 minutes and has cooled back down again. There's the bag of chestnut. And you can see there's still loads and loads of suds forming in there. So just a little bit of a squeeze around and then I'm going to strain off and rinse my wool. It should be perfectly clean now. Then I'm going to go on to mordant it. Now I'm not going to film this bit because it's standard mordanting practice. It's pure wool, so I'm just going to use ordinary potash alum. I'm going to use 10% by weight of the yarn. I've got about 250 grams here, so 25 grams of alum. Put it into water, put the yarn in, bring it up to the boil nice and slowly, stirring occasionally, and then I'm just going to let it cool down overnight before rinsing it, and we'll be ready to carry on with our dyeing. Look at those lovely suds. You can see why this is such a good cleanser. It's the next morning and the mordanted yarn has been strained and rinsed, and these ones that soaked overnight are now coming up to the boil. I'm going to boil them for an hour. So just to recap, that's the one that's got the alkaline in it, the wood ash solution. That's the one that's just in water. You can see the foam from the saponins being released even now. I'm expecting quite a bit of bubbles before these are ready. Anyway, they're going to boil for about an hour. I'll turn them down once they get to a good rolling boil. Then I'll sieve out the conker husks and then we'll see what colour we get. Even just the husks boiling away look like bubble bath, don't they? You can see why brands such as Badadas became so famous. They used an extract of horse chestnut, which historically has been used to treat things like varicose veins and soothe skin, and it became an incredibly popular brand all through the 70s and onwards. These have been cooking away for an hour now, and we've got some very promising looking results. Obviously things will change as they're rinsed and dried, but that's the one with the alkali. And this one, different spoon, is the plain one. Now I've got 2 skeins in here and I want to modify one of them. So over here I've got some hot water. It's always important to keep things at fairly similar temperature, and I've got about 1.5 grams of iron salts. So I'm just going to give that a little dissolve. Now iron's quite powerful, you never need very much of it, but it can change colours in quite an interesting way. So let's see, if I can hook out one of these skeins, just let it drain for a moment, and then we'll get it into the iron liquid. and I'm hoping it's going to darken the colour slightly. So it's a little bit hit and miss this. At this precise moment I'm not seeing a lot of change, but we'll give that a minute or two to soak. I'm also going to put another blank skein into the alkaline bath to use up some of the leftover colours. If this doesn't do it, in 10 minutes I'll put another ½ gram of iron in. It's always a case of little with iron. Well, I think that might be a little bit different. We'll let that stew and we'll come back and see what the end results are in a bit. And here they are, supervised by Cat, because there's got to be a cat in my videos, hasn't there? That one's Tesla again. So we have got the one that had ammonia in, that had a good long stew. This is the exhaust of that one. I would call those maybe cinnamon tones. They're quite subtle. This is the one that was just the husks boiled up. It's an unassuming but perfectly pleasant, nice golden yellow. And then the one with the iron, we've got a lovely, cool, licheny, greeny grey. They are not dramatically deep colours, but I really like them. I think these soft shades often work very, very nicely, and they're certainly an easy enough one to do. So, it just remains for me to wish you all happy hedge bothering, and anybody for a game of conkers?